gentlemen, before we begin with the panels, in my role as chair, there are just a few housekeeping rules that I need to mention. In terms of social media, we expect some great comments to be made, so please capture those on social media, and the handle, once again, is @NYTLive, #INYTDemocracy. There is free Wi-Fi, and to get on the network, it's Athens Democracy Forum. Refreshments and lunch, we will take our first break around 11 o'clock, 11:20, and then lunch at around 1:45. Refreshments will be served directly outside this room. Your mobile phones, please put them on silent mode or turn them off completely. Please take a moment to check your phones now. And then questions from the audience. We endeavour to take as many questions as possible, so please, the moderators will be asking you to contribute. So we have now come to the first of our 4 40-minute panels, which will be moderated by Serge Schmemann. Serge, please join us. Serge is the member of Editorial Board of the New York Times, based in Paris, who incidentally is also the program director for the Athens Democracy Forum. So thank you, Serge, for putting a wonderful program together, thoughtful topics and speakers. I also call on our 3 panelists to join Serge. Eric Lee, venture capitalist and political scientist based in Shanghai. He's the founder and managing director of Changwei Capital. Paula Dobriansky is the former Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs in the United States. And Benny Tai, Associate Professor of Law, University of Hong Kong, and notably the initiator of the Occupy Central Campaign for Democracy in Hong Kong. Is liberal democracy universal, Serge? Over to you.
We'll find out. Can you hear me? Yeah, we'll find out shortly. And of course, we will all be challenged on these panels to be as eloquent as Adrian Clarkson was. Thank you very much for your wonderful words. Welcome to everyone to the first of our panels. We have relatively short time, so I will dispense with any more introductions, and we will not have opening comments by the speakers. We'll plunge directly into the questions. Our subject, which launches today's panel discussions, is whether the broad model of liberal democracy, as we know it in the West, is really universal. Russia and China in particular have challenged this notion, arguing that a system of what they call vertical democracy, in which a strong government and ruling party represent the will of the people, without the disruption of party politics and changing governments, is more effective and more suited to their cultures. The case for liberal democracy lies primarily in its example, in what it has to show the world. And here, as Achilles has pointed out to you earlier, we have been often found wanting. The migration drama, which is currently unfolding in Europe and here in Greece, is actually a blot, I think, on many of our systems, on the European democratic system, with many elected leaders preferring to take a populist approach and to contribute to the fears of their populations. Borders are being closed. The entire system of open borders is challenged. And in the United States, of course, we also have a yawning political divide that is not showing a very attractive side of our democracy. As I wrote in the introduction to yesterday's special report, we in the United States and the West are no longer seen by much of the world as the shining city on a hill. And the question we will be posing is whether this is a flaw or the natural state of evolution. So our panel today is hopefully sharply divided on these issues, and we will plunge right in. Let me turn to you, Paula. You were in many administrations on national security. You spent years as Undersecretary for Democracy and Global Affairs. We are, I think, in Western democracies, often quite on the defensive, as I just was minutes ago. Does this worry you? Is there an inherent flaw in our model that other systems may have a better answer for?
First, let me say thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank the International New York Times and also the Athens Democracy Forum. My answer to that is no, because democracy is not a linear process. When you look at even the history of the United States and its own evolution, it is ever changing, ever improving. But I would say there are certain foundations that are, in my book, indisputable. No matter where you live, on what continent, you want accountability from your government. You want to be able to have the right to make your government accountable to you and to have the right to change that government if it is corrupt, if it is not responsive to your needs and your demands, and without any fear or threat of doing so. But I think we need to be reminded that, again, the core concept, it's not a linear process. There are constant changes, there are ebbs and flows, and I think that that's what makes it not only universal, but also very rich in its own substance and its own foundation, because it is undergirded by universal values which we all share, despite our different cultures, despite our different histories. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. That was indeed very concise and a good example, I think, for all the panelists to follow today. Eric, you have prospered as a capitalist, but you have at the same time argued eloquently in many articles I've read and in conversations we've had that Western democratic system, which we in the West usually see as a prerequisite for a free market, is the wrong system for China. Your point, as I understand it, is that for the Chinese, the best system is for the market and civil society to be subservient to a strong ruling party. Does this not inevitably lead, as it did in the Soviet Union and perhaps in certain parts of China's modern history, to a dictatorship?
Thanks. Well, I'm a venture capitalist. I'm not a political person. And as a venture capitalist, whenever I see a situation or I analyze a situation, I look at track record. An entrepreneur comes to me, I look at his track record. A company comes to me for investment, I look at his track record. I think one thing we should be aware of is we're in Athens. Democracy has had a very short track record. It survived here for, by the most liberal count, maybe 200 years at the most, probably much less. Then we lived for a couple of thousand years, during which democracy was a dirty word. Nobody wanted it. And during that period, of course, we created marvelous civilizations. Great music, great art, great culture. We marvel at them in concert halls and museums. I think human civilization did very well without democracy. In Greece, actually didn't work out too well. Then, of course, with the onset of Enlightenment, democratic ideas came back. But as we define it, as Western countries, the version of democracy they're selling to the rest of the world has had an extraordinarily short track record. It probably began, if you define democracy as one person, one vote, it probably began in America in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, or 66, I don't remember. So it's not even 100 years. So altogether, they're probably shorter than China's shorter dynasties. So democracy is a very short track record. And I think we need to be very careful about being overconfident in something that hasn't had a long track record of producing good lives for people. It has succeeded in many aspects. And I think in China, we had a different system. Had a lot of problems, a lot of disasters in the initial period, but in the last 30, 40 years, it hasn't done so badly. China has, under the one-party state, lifted 650 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years. Let me give you some perspective of what that is. I'm here, sitting here, listening to people taking refugees, 50,000 people to Canada, 60,000 to America, whatever it is. Let me give you some perspective. China has been lifting more than that number of people out of poverty every single day, including Saturday and Sunday, in the last 30 years.
That is indeed a powerful case, but many times you lived and live in Hong Kong, and you led the democracy movement in which students went out in the street and blocked all the streets and sat under yellow umbrellas because you fundamentally disagreed with this notion that a strong central government should be able to dictate the results, the form of government you have. Your fight was, in effect, for universal suffrage. And yet, you live in prosperity, you live in peace. Why is it so important to challenge this existing system and to demand universal suffrage?
Well, I would try to argue a case for the supporting universal suffrage is universal on the basis of human nature, of human needs. I think that's kind of common knowledge that we have different levels of needs, that people need to have their food, need to have their materialistic needs satisfied, and then they need to have a kind of sense of security, safety. But once people has arrived at that kind of needs, they want freedoms. And if freedoms are being tolerated by the authorities, they want to have, again, more security that their freedoms will be protected. They want rights rather than just freedoms. And so constraints on the government powers will be needed. And how to constrain the powers of government? The right to select our own leaders will be a way, not the only way, but that's one of the ways. That's about democratic election. And further on that, we want our identity be recognized. And also, we want to participate in the government, not just in selecting our leaders every 4 years or 5 years, but actually the right to participate. And also, we start to care about the rights of other people. There's a kind of levels of needs. So in the case of Hong Kong, I think that our materialistic needs are well satisfied. We have a safe environment. I think the people has already gained the kind of consciousness that we want more than just materialistic needs satisfied, safety, secure. We want freedoms, we want rights to be secure, we want the right to select our leaders. Actually, it's something more. And so, to answer your question in a very short way, that because the Hong Kong people, I'm not talking about the whole population yet, but Hong Kong is now in a very divided society. We still have maybe more than half the population may share Eric's view. But that's another half, or close to half the population, will see something more on my side, that we want something more than just materialistic needs and security. We want freedoms, rights, the right to select our leaders, and even more. And we have the young people with us, and also the more educated people with us. That is the situation of Hong Kong.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
I wanted to comment on something Eric said, if I may. Eric mentioned as the definition of democracy, you said possibly is one person, one vote. I would want to correct that, if I may, because democracy is not just about an election or two. Democracy is about so many elements of one society. It's about institutions. It is about freedom of press. It is about freedom of religion. But it is about also your checks and balances, rule of law. There are many components, and why democracy is not only universal, it is being challenged, but it is not in retreat, in my mind, at all, because when you look at the kinds of institutions that we have post-World War II, post-Cold War, these very institutions have been the institutions that have held peace, stability, security. As I said, we are being challenged, but it is not in retreat. And if you look at many countries in the neighborhood, just across the straits in Taiwan, or you look at Indonesia, you look at Japan, many of these countries have been able to, and many of these states have been able to combine a democratic path, political rights, with also economic growth and progress. It goes hand in hand. And just a final comment is on immigration. I think immigration is a key point. I look at my own society. Our problem is keeping people out. Why do they come? They come because they have a choice. They know that in our society, that there's opportunity, that opportunity affords economic growth and the potential to live to the fullest.
Well, thank you. Before I let Eric respond, we had an email exchange, and Eric correctly pointed out that he was a bit of a minority here, so I'll take your side today.
With that, I'll definitely win.
We got it.
You got to fake it right now.
Yeah, down with democracy. No, to be serious here, I wanted to follow up what you said, Benny. You said that half the population of Hong Kong does not yet feel ready. And what you said, Paula, that there are institutions. These institutions took centuries to develop, to evolve. And in Hong Kong, it is also a process where now half the population feels they're ready, perhaps, for universal suffrage, and that must be part of their life. But if, in fact, it is a process, then how can we in the West impose our model, which is the result of a long evolution? And why should we not be patient with models that see an authoritarian period as a prerequisite for the freedom we see at the end?
Well, I'm not arguing that we need to have the kind of electoral systems as in the West overnight. Actually, we were just asking for a clear timeline on how the things will evolve. And actually, I would totally accept if China say that, okay, in the election in 2017, that's the coming election, we will have some kind of screening of candidates, one person, one vote, but then promise that, well, the next election will have how the thing will evolve and then change. And as the people gain more understanding through the election, I think that's what we are asking for. But actually, I'm not totally against you, Eric, that actually I'm maybe on your side in the case of China, because if I follow the kind of level of needs, that democracy, I would say, that's still under challenge in the modern world, that especially maybe even the Western world, that if democracy fails to deliver the materialistic needs and the safety to the people, that's a danger of regression, that people will start to ask, what's the value of that vote if that cannot provide us the needs and the security? But the case of China, that if the Chinese people have their materialistic needs satisfied, have their safety secure, then would they also evolve in a way, change their will to ask for more? I don't know that, Eric, you maybe know more about the situation in China. Actually, I've talked with young people in China. Up to this point, I cannot see that kind of urge for democracy. But how about 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What will be the situation? So as a venture capitalist, I think you have to see the future in a way. So how do you see the future?
Well, I want a future that works.
Yeah.
And when I see around the world, democracies are not working. So it's hard for a venture capitalist to be convinced that I want this for the future. So if you want to sell democracy, you better make yours work. Number one. Number two, I want to respectfully disagree with what Paula said. After the Cold War, an enormous number of countries converted their political systems from whatever it was to electoral democracies. I think according to Freedom House, it went from 47 to 180 or some crazy number. If you survey that large number of countries, vast majority have done very, very poorly, especially in the developing world. There's still mired civil disorder, some in war, poverty. Without China, the entire world's poverty reduction has gone backwards. More people living in poverty, okay, since the end of the Cold War. If you look at China's neighborhood, You mentioned Indonesia. Was very corrupt under Suharto. Afterwards, they did all the right things. Elections, independent press, rule of law, the institutions you mentioned, but the country got more corrupt. You know, according to the Australian professor, McIntyre, I think his name, did great research on Indonesia. It says we went from one big Suharto to thousands of little Suhartos. Got much worse. The only two places that converted within sort of Confucian culture, Korea and Taiwan, they democratized after they got very rich already. And of those, Korea continues to succeed, but Taiwan deteriorated tremendously in the last 20 years. The high-tech miracle went away, medium income dropping, politics poisoned. Out of the 23 million people living on Taiwan, on the most conservative count, 1.5 million had immigrated to the mainland. And of those immigrated, they were highly educated, highly skilled, and young and productive age. So the educated elites in Taiwan, half of them have gone to the mainland. And if you go to Africa, go to Southeast Asia, the record is not very good. And if you look at developed countries, look at America today, nothing can be done. All these reforms that are needed, not being implemented. Look at Britain, look at Europe, everywhere. Immigration reform, healthcare reform, nothing is being done. So if you look at all these countries, I haven't done the research, but somebody should. But my gut feeling is, if you look at all the electoral democracies, those who get elected after an election, their approval rating fall immediately within 6 months to below 50, 40, 30%. I call it a perpetual cycle of elect and regret. So why is that? I mean, you guys better fix it before you try to sell it to us.
Well, may I
Go for it.
several points on this. As you were citing a number of countries and areas which you said that they're being challenged economically, I will say that there might be economic challenges, but the political rights have been maintained. But I could also think of other areas where there have been changes. We look at the change in the decision made by the Burmese to hold elections in Burma, and you have many people pouring out to participate in that political activism. I was in Burma not too long ago, and I saw quite a change from what it was economically before and what it is now. Ukraine, in a different part of the world, people were demonstrating on the Maidan, and not only because they wanted to make the choice of joining Europe, but also they were demonstrating against corruption. So I will say that in the context of a democracy, you not only have the right to improve yourselves, but individually, but also to even contest what you don't like. And in that sense, I don't think the countries that are pursuing purely an economic model, they're stunting their growth. I take the Arab Human Development Report. There were several of them that were written under the auspices of the United Nations. And they asked the question, why is it that we have not advanced ourselves economically? Well, one of the reasons given, only one, politically, I'm citing, was that half of the population was not voting. I'm referring to women in many of the societies. These were not Americans talking about the Middle East. These were actually Arab scholars talking about the lack of development. And the final point I would make here is that there isn't an imposition of a model. There shouldn't be. Models are different. But what is the same is the universality of the preservation of human rights in a democracy. To pass a law preventing foreign NGOs because of a quote-unquote threat that they might pose, whether in Russia or China, or there's a recent counterterrorism law that relates to one's thought, one's activism, etc. There's a lot that runs up against rule of law. So when you have your own constitution and you have the laws within, the parameters within that constitution, you want your laws to respect it. You want your people's rights to be respected. I would submit that you can have both, and that kind of model does work.
Let's make a bet. 10 years from now, are we betting the people of Ukraine and people of Burma will be living in economic prosperity, free of corruption? I'd bet against that.
I bet that the people of Ukraine and the people of Burma, if given the opportunity and not threatened or prevented, will both advance themselves economically, but also will have political rights.
Well, certainly that's not the track record in the last 30 years of all these countries who started voting. Voting has not delivered in the last 30 years. I'm not saying voting cannot. I'm just saying you better really
Again,
work on it, make it
democracy
deliver
is
if you
not
want.
just
But
about
I think
voting.
the issue is not so much about selling to China. I think no one sells
It's
democracy
universal.
to Hong Kong people. It is just the consciousness of the need to select our own leaders to participate in the government process. That is the kind of need that just come out from ourselves. It's not being sold to us. It's just come out from us. So I'm just, the question for Eric, I would like his view is that how do you see how Chinese people will see, not just the Chinese government accepting the democratic model or not, but whether the Chinese people will see the need or that kind of participation. And another point I want to make is about democracy. I think democracy is not just merely about the electoral democracy. I think the problems of a lot of established democracy facing that they put too much emphasis only on the electoral democracy. And we have participatory democracy, allowing people to participate. We have deliberative democracy, where we have a good quality of deliberation for making policies that will be able to get the consensus or the kind of support of the whole society. That is the base of development. I think democracies in the West, or the liberal democracy, lacks is the degree of participation and deliberation, and we need to work on that. Now, if that can, I may be a bit too idealistic that even in the West of getting this kind of democracy will be, we may need some time to build it up, but I think the base is that we at least have the right to select our own leaders.
Yeah. First of all, we'll be taking bets at the back of the hall after this session about the future of Ukraine and Burma. We'll offer really good odds. But I think one strong point Eric has made repeatedly is that democracy is judged by its fruits. And you can argue that it represents the will of the people, that it is a system that gives people a voice, that it is a system of law. But when you look, for example, at what happened last night in Brussels, when they couldn't agree on the most marginal quota for taking in refugees, when countries of East Europe that had recently been part of the Soviet bloc were now refusing to accept even a handful of refugees, it gives a bad image. You, Benny, coming out of Hong Kong, you've just fought in the streets for an ideal, and then you come here and see how it works. Does this trouble you?
Well, as I just said, that it is a kind of evolving process, not just in the system, but also in the self-consciousness of the people who want democracy, who practice democracy. I think the democracy idea, as already mentioned, is not merely about that vote. It's about also human rights protection, the rights of other people. I think Michael Coxon talked about the story, how the Canadians kind of take care of the refugees coming. This kind of thing is the spirit of democracy. And I think maybe the situation, I am not so sure, the situation of Greece, would it be because of the democratic system failing to deliver the kind of materialistic needs, or the European states, some of them think afraid that their materialistic needs, their security will be threatened by receiving refugees, and cause them to make that kind of decision. And so that is the challenge for humanity, that how we're going to advance democracy. And it is not just gaining that vote. I think it's important, but it's much more than that vote, because that vote is just a door to that humanity that Madam Clarkson kind of pointed out to us, that is the whole value of being a human.
Let me just, for a second, turn to you, Eric. You had mentioned that as a venture capitalist, you look for systems that work. But just as a footnote, there are a lot of very successful venture capitalists in the States, as far as I know, who are certainly not hampered by the system and support it. And also on the betting front, I would bet that in 10 years there are going to be many, many people in China who share the feelings of the Occupy Central people in Hong Kong.
Well, it's possible, but I think it will depend on how democracies perform in the next 10 years. If you continue on this path, it will be fewer, let me guarantee you. Because the Chinese are not stupid. They're not going to want to buy something that doesn't work, that's all. Now, but let me come back to it. I think, I'm respectful of democracies. I think it's a good ideal. Actually, democratic ideas have delivered a lot in the modern age. However, I think the difference here is that I think the troubles, let me venture to guess, I think the troubles in democracy today come from the notion that the conviction that it is universal and it is permanent and it's the best thing we've got. Whenever you think you've got the best thing you've got, I think it's hard to improve. I think, Benny, you asked me about the Chinese people. I think the Chinese people are and should be open to alternatives. I don't think they should close their doors on democracy. But I don't think they should do what many Westerners are doing today, which is rejecting beforehand any other alternatives. And just say, by principle, a priori, this is the only thing we've got. This is the only moral thing we could do. I think that's really a source of a lot of your problems.
Okay, Paula.
I
And afterwards, we will open the floor, so I can't see you. You'll have to really raise your hands high.
I was going to just make 2 points. You can't take, say, the model of democracy or democracy as it is in the United States and merely take it and transplant it on the soil of another country. That's not what one is talking about here. But what one is talking about in terms of universality is the protection of human rights, of which, as a political system, democracy is the best guarantor. And there are certain clear lines that are drawn in this context of what constitutes a democracy and a democratic process and what doesn't. And so toward that end, I would say that it's not a different model. You either have an election and democratic institutions and those components, and there are many ways. I mean, the government of France, the way it's structured is quite different from, and Britain, quite different from the way the United States executes its democracy. But there are certain concepts which are universal and which form the foundation. One other footnote, I was going to make the same comment about venture capitalists. When I think about the United States, many go to the United States to develop their technologies. And I think about that. Why do they go? They go because of the opportunity afforded them, and no less the results that are afforded them. One of the reasons why we have this issue of the question of inequality, you have many who have gone, but then they take those monies also and they reinvest them, and they also put them in very, very good causes. So I would look at, on the economic side, actually a democracy has really afforded that kind of burgeoning of technological innovation.
So, Eric, we welcome your money and your criticism in the West. Do we have questions? Sir Richard.
Inevitably, my question's addressed to Eric. The authoritarian market model is great when the market's doing what you want. When it stops doing what you want, the situation's rather different. And the communist leadership of China, and communism, the word hasn't passed your lips today, has shown itself to be stunningly incompetent over the last 2 or 3 months in dealing with the development of an unfavorable market situation. This is not a political question. This is an economic question to you as a venture capitalist. What next in China?
They're incompetent on many things. Let me put it that way. By and large, they're being very competent. In fact, they have been competent in the past 30 years during market downturns. I mean, I lived through many of them. The Asian financial crisis was one of them, 1997, much worse than today's correction. In the early 2000s, the real estate collapses. So they've done well. In this particular instance, there seems many more difficulties. I believe it's because of the larger economies being restructured, so it brings in a lot of uncertain elements. I think it's too early to call whether they could react well under the circumstances. But judging by past track record, I think they will do reasonably well. We're not sure yet, but I take it there are a lot of difficulties at the moment.
Thanks. I see a question all the way in the back. We have very, very little time, so please do keep it as brief as possible. Can we have a microphone in the very back?
Nazanin Ansari, I'm an Iranian journalist. Regarding imposing democracy, number one, during the 2009 Green Revolution in Iran, it wasn't America trying to impose, but rather it was the Chinese who sent the anti-crowd tanks to keep the demonstrators at bay. And one other point about democracy is that what we haven't mentioned here is that change is inevitable. And for the moment, democracy is the only system where change can take place peacefully. And whether if we want to have change in China, can it take place peacefully? Can change take place peacefully in Iran at the moment? I very much doubt it. But in America, in Britain, in anywhere else in Europe, change can take place peacefully. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That is more of a comment than a question. So I will continue. Margarita?
Thanks very much. Eric, I'm a German entrepreneur and a professor of US foreign policy. If you allow me a comment. I studied the American Constitution. Thomas Paine said, what Athens was in miniature, America will be in, Washington will be in magnitude. If you study the philosophy of the American Constitution and the Founding Fathers, I think the strength was that they knew from the beginning, studying ancient philosophy, and they were reading ancient Greek and they were reading Latin, they realized that the ideal will never be, they would never succeed with the ideal. It would always be an approximation to liberty, an approximation to freedom, an approximation to democracy. And they knew it's a piecemeal engineering process. And I think this is the strength of the West. This is the strength of our values. And this is why America, for 250 years almost, was saved from communism, from fascism, from nationalism. Of course, I mean, we all know the deficiencies, but that is in the system. We know we will never be perfect, and I think this is our strength.
Do you have a comment, or?
Well, I have two comments. First, comment on the lady in the back. Changes can take place peacefully in democracies. I don't know. Iraq, that became a democracy. Are changes taking place peacefully? If changes could take place peacefully in new democracies, we wouldn't have these refugee problems. That the Westerners went in there with their militaries and instituted new regimes and called them democratic, but look at what's happening now. So I think, I'm not discrediting this. I just think that we ought to be more circumspect and don't be so self-confident. Second, yes, correct. I think the American founders of the American Republic were very, very wise men, as you quoted Adams in your paper, on your pages yesterday, as saying that democracy is not the same thing as good governance. Democracy is has the same potential of being corrupt, not work as any other political system. I think his offsprings have totally forgotten that.
I'm afraid that we are really almost out of time. I see a lot of questions, but there are many more panels to go. There was a gentleman there I had promised to give the last question to.
Hi, Tawfiq Rahim, based in the UAE. Very quickly, just first on track record, I don't know any venture capitalists who invest in 2015 based on market dynamics in 15, but we can talk about that on an aside. But I agree with a lot of the points you made, and I wanted to ask to the panelists based on something Paula said. You talked about rights, we talked about different elements of a democracy. Do you think we need to change the conversation from democracy to more of a discussion of inclusion, rights, and governance? Because it seems that the focus on democracy is leading to a moralistic kind of claim to a system where it's really the principles of that system that we may seek to implement. And on the Middle East, if you take a look at it, it's those principles that are important, and actually the word democracy is a very dirty word in that part of the world. Thank you.
Well, that's a perfect opportunity for you to give a closing word.
Well, I think together with Eric, we are descendants of Deng Xiaoping, that we believe in black cat, white cat, that what it works is that it can catch a mouse. But the difference of us is that what is that mouse? That at some point of time, that mouse may mean food. But then another point of time, that mouse may mean something more than that. It may mean dignity. It may mean the right to participate in the process. I don't know when the Chinese people will see that mouse as merely food or the dignity we're talking about, but from my argument, that this is a human nature, that the time will come.
Paula.
I would say that democracy is the best guarantor of human rights, and so it goes hand in hand. And I also think that, as you very eloquently stated, and the questioner before, democracy is flexible, it's evolutionary, as I said right at the very beginning in a very precise statement. It's not the democratic evolution is not a linear process. There is flexibility for change, and that is an aspect that I think is the most advantageous and one of its biggest assets, in addition to government being accountable to people. That's what undergirds it.
Well, let me finish by saying something about rights. I think it's much more complex than the way it's being presented here. Let me give you one example. Freedom of speech. That's a right. However, that right, I believe, today seems to be producing a lot of problems in America. Is the right to speak. The right to speak is, if I have legitimately earned money, can I spend that to buy TV commercials to support political candidates? Can I spend that to support political initiatives? American Supreme Court says, yes, that is your unalienable right to freedom of speech. I actually think it leads to money in politics. So rights are not that simple. It's a complicated issue. We got to step back and think about it instead of taking it in as a faith.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this a lot. I hope you all have.
Thank you. It's great to see such diversity on a panel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you to Serge, Eric, Paula, and Benny. And our second panel